Okay, so I split this presentation kind of into two parts. The first is titled, What is the Role of Biology in Artificial Intelligence? Here I'll give a brief history lesson of the times biological neural nets inspired their artificial counterparts, and in particular we'll focus on the artificial neural networks used in deep learning today. So we've got a drawing of the real deal here on the left, a real neuron you'd find in your skull. And then we've got a mathematical representation of it, a mathematical model on the right called the point neuron model. And I've highlighted analogous structures in the same color. So variable sized inputs arrive on the dendrites and travel to the triangular cell body where those electrical signals are summated. And then if the summed activity is large enough, if it reaches a certain threshold, then you will elicit electrical activity in the red axon. In that analogous structure, we mathematically model it as the activation function in the point neuron model. And you'll see, I'll use this notation a little bit more later on, but the red axon is cut off with those parallel bars. I will cut off some of the dendrites later as well, so they just get a little unruly. Here's a real simple artificial neural network if you're not familiar with these. So the summation in the middle neuron would go something like this. The connections are multiplicative weight factors. And so you'd go 1 times 1, and you'd add that to 2 times -1. The input, or the summed input at the cell body here would be -1. Then we're going to pass that -1 to an activation function. The one we use most typically in deep learning today is ReLU. So this is meant to represent that you need to overcome a certain threshold of summed input to get any output across that axon. And so since that kink in ReLU happens at input of 0, so since our input is negative, it's going to be rounded to 0. 0 times 2 is 0. And learning is thought to occur in your brain, and we do learning in these artificial neural networks by just changing these weights, changing these multiplicative factors. So you can see here we get rather different outputs if we make this connection between the middle neuron and the top left one much stronger, 3 times stronger. And we'll just end up drawing them like this. We won't color code the negatives or the positive weights. And we won't usually draw thicknesses. You'll see them like this, where they're all the same color. And all the numbers are omitted as well. Okay, just to add a little bit more clarity, what the real neurons are doing and how we mathematically model them. Here's 2 neurons on the left. The upstream neuron is furthest left, and on the right we've got the downstream neuron. And you see there is no activity across the axons in red. We can have some electrical activity. The units of electrical activity are called action potentials or voltage spikes. I'm just going to draw them as these cute little lightning bolts, right? So we've got 1 action potential on the upstream neuron, but it's not strong enough to elicit any activity in the downstream one. We can have 3 action potentials, still nothing. We can increase the influence of these 3 action potentials by moving them closer. And that's enough to actually cause an action potential to occur in the downstream neuron. And notice what happens here. In the real neurons, as we move this connection closer, in the artificial version, you can see this weight is getting bigger. So the multiplicative factor is getting larger. Likewise, if we move this connection further away, that multiplicative factor gets really tiny. And we're back to not producing any output in the downstream neuron. But this multiplicative factor is doing double duty. We're shuffling, or we're sweeping a lot of real biology underneath this one multiplication. And we'll see later on that it's actually doing like septuple duty, but I'll just show you double duty for now. Another way to increase the influence this upstream neuron's action potentials have on the downstream one firing is there's this little gap between the neurons. And this needs to be bridged by the red chemicals being spit out and caught by the blue ones. And you can increase the weight, increase the influence this neuron has on the downstream one by increasing the amount of red chemicals spit out and increasing the amount of blue chemicals that are catching them. And you see here when we do both of those additions, yet again, even though this connection is really far away, it is strong enough of a connection to influence the downstream one to fire an action potential as well. And that's kind of where we were at in 1958 with Frank Rosenblatt's perceptron. He was using these point neuron models, and he was testing what was then theoretical neuroscience and is now taken as pretty much fact, that learning in our brains occurs through changing these connection strengths between neurons. And his simple neural network kind of looked like what you'd see on the right. He had 400 input neurons being provided values from a rudimentary camera, and then they were all attached to a single neuron in the next layer, and he trained it to answer yes or no questions. Fast forward 22 years, this is work by a Japanese scholar named Kunihiko Fukushima, and he is famous for making the neocognitron. And it was in this work that he introduced convolutional and downsampling layers, which are ubiquitously used in deep learning today. And he got inspiration from Hubel and Wiesel's model of visual cortex processing. These guys were experimentalists, and they were doing electrical probing into mammalian eyes, specifically in cats and monkeys, and also if you remove this back part of your skull, the part of the brain underneath there, they were also doing electrical investigations into that. And that inspired kind of what you'll see here on the right. So we've got this kind of grid layer. This is like a rudimentary low resolution image that might come across your retina in your eye, right? And instead of being every single neuron on the left being connected to every single neuron on the right, this is called fully connected. Our eyeballs in parts of our brain do something like this instead. So I've kind of color coded the boxes with the neurons that they'd be connected to in the layer on the right. Okay, so this is used a whole bunch. This was inspired by empirical investigations into the mammalian brain. And then if we fast forward yet again another 40 years, we're talking about modern convolutional neural networks. There are actually very few software changes you have to do to the neocognitron from the 1980s to get to modern convolutional neural networks. The biggest one is going to be backpropagation of error. So this is just how nowadays we use calculus to update these weights. And then I think that the latest wave of interest in AI, the latest AI summer that started in 2012, a decade ago, is more in not due to software, but more because we started using massively parallel hardware. You can see this graph here, which is logarithmic. So these straight lines are actually exponential growth. And this is just showing that since AlexNet in 2012, a decade ago, almost every year since then, we've thrown actually an order of magnitude more compute at these problems. And I think people could do better at teasing apart these effects when they're talking about the results. And Fuxin Li, our deep learning professor, I didn't hear this from him directly, but I've heard several students talk about hearing this in his class on deep learning, that they talk about this AlexNet paper in 2012. And he says very similar, not a lot has changed since, the 1980s. And that paper just added ReLU. And I'd like to make the distinction that it really did just add ReLU. It didn't invent ReLU. I can find this activation function being used in 1968 by Fukushima, the same guy who made the neocognitron. And I can find very similar ideas in some of Frank Rosenblatt's later work in 1962. It's like a 600-page document. So I gave up looking. He's definitely batting around in the same idea space. So he might have even known about it. And here's a list. I won't go through each one of these, but these are current challenges in deep learning. All of these existed 10 years ago with this latest wave of interest in AI. And in my opinion, none of these have been cracked yet. But our brains have solutions to all of these big problems. and its solution runs on only 20 watts. If you're doing something really cognitively demanding, maybe it's 25 watts. So I hope that this brief history lesson has convinced you that they're not called artificial neural networks by accident, and that empirical investigations of biological neural networks have made deep learning possible. And we'll wrap up part one with me just saying my current research heuristic, and that is stay on the path evolution has already laid towards intelligence. Evolution by natural selection has spent astronomical time, compute, and entropy creating us. If you're not on this path, then you have to replicate millions, potentially hundreds of millions of years of R&D. Please, I beg you, if you're researching into this stuff, don't attempt to reinvent the most complicated wheel that's ever existed. Our unique yet very natural search abilities, I think, will be required further along this path. Okay, so history lesson over. That's part one. Part two is just I'm going to introduce 3 concepts from contemporary neuroscience and how I incorporated them into artificial neural networks in deep learning. Okay, so weight sparsity is the first of the 3 concepts we need to talk about. Weight is like synonymous with connections. So this is inspired by your brain because you've got 86 billion neurons bouncing around in your caboodle, but on average, each one is only connected to a few thousand, right? So these connections are sparse. Only a few, not even a fraction of a percentage really, of all possible connections exist. And so in deep learning, our artificial neural networks tend to be densely connected or fully connected, kind of like shown up here, where every single neuron in one layer is connected to every single neuron in the next layer. And so to induce weight sparsity, to remove and prune some of these connections, I used a technique called iterative magnitude pruning. And I'm just gonna walk you through how we do that. So we'd start with some simple neural network like this, and we're gonna randomly initialize these connection strengths. And then we're gonna train it a little bit. So you can see, right, these connection strengths have changed. We're gonna take an arbitrary percentage of the smallest weights. For this example, I'm using 50%, but in the experiments, I used 12.5%. So 1 out of every 8 connections was pruned. So here we go, smallest half are gone. And then what's really important is you can't just start training again yet. You need to reinitialize these remaining values to what they were before this network was trained at all on any training data. And then we'll kind of do this in loops. We've been introduced to a full cycle. We will train some more. We will then prune 50% of the remaining weights, and then we will reinitialize the remaining weights to what they were before any training occurred. And you'll just keep doing this until you've got the desired sparsity level you want. Okay, so that's INP, a way to get weight sparsity. Here's what this looks like in a fully small, like 2 or 3 layer fully connected network trained to do image recognition of handwritten digits, i.e. MNIST, if you're familiar with that. And the blue line, or the red line is INP, which we just went through, but the blue line is going to be if you just decide to randomly prune the connections, right? And this performance, you can get away with random pruning to about we've got 50 to 30% of your weights remaining, right? And then this performance gap really shows. Using INP becomes really beneficial, especially once you get down to you can get down to here, it's like 3% of your original weights left. So we've reduced the amount of multiplications you have to do in this network 33-fold, and you're still doing about just as well as when you started with a fully dense network. This is the same network, but trained on a more difficult task, CIFAR-10. Yet again, big benefits from using INP as opposed to just randomly removing connections. And then this is my favorite result. If instead of using a fully connected network, you use a convolutional neural network, like those inspired by investigations into our eyes of mammals in the back part of our brain. Here we get down to about 50-fold compression. So we've removed all but 1 out of 50 multiplications that we started with, and we're still doing better than the fully dense network. So I'm going to preface this with hopefully, I'm doing some foreshadowing, hopefully our hardware will allow us to benefit from the sparsity and to skip these multiplications by 0, but that might not be the case. So I just showed you weight sparsity. Activation sparsity is a very similar concept. Your brain has activation sparsity. If I put you in a scanner, like an fMRI scanner, we'd be able to tell that at any given moment, only a few percentage of your neurons in your brain are active at any one time. So it's actively sparse. And so I showed you this where the 1 times 3 becomes a 1 times 0. Hopefully the hardware lets us get ahead of that and skip it. But the other side of this coin, which is activation sparsity, is you can force the output of that upstream neuron to be 0 instead. And hopefully we can skip that computation. And how we'll induce activation sparsity in these artificial neural networks is just by taking ReLU and shifting it dynamically for each layer of the network. And how you decide how far you shift it left or right depends on how much activation sparsity you want. So this modified ReLU that induces activation sparsity is called K winners takes all, or KWTA. And K is a hyperparameter that you can play with. Here in this example, I'm going to use K equals 2. And so what we do is we take the 2 largest summed inputs, 9 and 5 in this case, and these are going to take all. These are going to be the 2 winners that take everything, meaning that the other 3 get suppressed to 0, and they don't get to have any activity. And right, this would be the same thing if we just remove these weights. And you can see if we do this for both layers, these are the multiplications we originally would have had to have done without activation sparsity. And maybe we can get away with just doing this subset of multiplications and save some compute cycles. But I've kind of prefaced this a little bit. Our current hardware, particularly graphics cards, GPUs, they don't really benefit and leverage sparsity in an interesting way. So these guys used an FPGA, which if you don't know what that is, it's a bit of hardware that big manufacturers will often use, and they can write software to change the hardware of this chip. So it's like really nice for prototyping. You want to see what this hypothetical chip would do. Well, you don't need to mass produce it first. You can just write some software for this FPGA. These guys, Hunter and Friends in 2021, did just that to show that they wrote hardware that could actually leverage sparsity. And if you put one fully dense network with all the connections and fully activated, and you compare it to a sparsely activated sparse weight network, that's sparse on this graph, if it's just a single network comparison, you can get speedups of almost 40 times. But what's really cool, right, is this hardware also didn't have to save all those zeros in memory. And so you can fit more networks on a given card. And that's what this full chip comparison on the right is showing, is that if you use the same amount of RAM and you can stuff more compressed models onto it, your throughput can actually be, in their case, they were using convolutional neural networks on the Google speech command dataset. They were getting throughput increases of 112 times. And this is just to show, I'm not picking only on the software guys. Maybe the hardware needs to change as well. Okay, weight sparsity, activation sparsity out of the way. The last thing we need to talk about, and I need to explain, and then we can show my results, is this thing called active dendrites, or active dendritic properties. So we've got one action potential coming to the downstream neuron, and this is an illustration of what passive dendrites would be. And passive dendrites are just in contrast to active dendrites. We used to think for a long time, both in neuroscience and in mathematically modeling them in artificial neural networks, that dendrites were passive. They were just kind of like cables, and you apply a voltage to one end, and as it travels towards where it's going to get summed, right, the voltage would just be attenuated. It would just slowly decrease like the height of a wave as it comes towards you on an ocean front. But we realized, especially experimentally, that if they were just passively filtering the voltage signal as they traveled towards the cell body, that 85% of the connections would be electrically isolated and wouldn't actually be able to influence the patterns of electrical activity going on in these neurons. And part of we kind of knew that there were active properties as opposed to passive ones in the 60s, but in the 90s we discovered like all of these and some more, right? So these are different types of spikes than action potential spikes. But what these do is they allow you to not just filter the signal down as it travels, but it can actually also be upregulated and boosted. So these are just other computations that neurons are doing with their dendrites. And this is what is called nowadays active dendritic properties. So earlier I showed you that this white line, this weight on the right, is kind of doing double duty, right? You can change this weight that we mathematically model by moving the connections up and down, or spitting out more of those red chemicals, adding more of those blue proteins to catch them. But really, all of these as well are shuffled under that single multiplicative weight nowadays. And so being afraid that we were going to break these things back, these guys, Gruel and friends in 2021, added a little bit more mathematical resolution, right? To tease these things apart. They were trying to model these types of active properties, and they just added a multiplication, right? You can see they kind of pulled apart the point neuron model, the circle, and just added a multiplication. And what it's multiplying is the summed input and a context signal that can be learned. And the context signal I used in this paper and they used is just task-specific information. So I encoded what task I was going to train the network on. So here you can see, I told it, hey, we're going to train on task 1. And task 1, I wasn't using this, but this is just an example. Task 1 could be, I want you to detect Pokemon in an image. And notice what happens when I tell it about task 2. It learns to up or down regulate individual neurons differently depending on what the task is. So task 2 is detecting dogs in the images. And for task 1, detecting Pokemon, this neuron on the left is pretty down regulated. It's not too important for the task, where this neuron on the right is very important. It is multiplied by a large value. And then they kind of switch roles here for task 2, where for task 1, the neuron on the left was not as important as the neuron on the right. It's vice versa here for task 2. And this type of thing is learned through training. Okay, so we've gotten through all three of the things that I used to mitigate what's called catastrophic forgetting. So this is a good example of what catastrophic forgetting is with a normal, typical neural network. What we're seeing here as we move across the x-axis is that we've trained this 3-layer MLP on more and more tasks. So task 1 we train it on, then we train it on task 2, task 3, etc. And after each task, we're testing how well it does across all tasks that it's trained on so far. And what's going on here is that each latest task it's training on, it's doing just as well as all the way to the left. You see that point. It's around 85% test accuracy. But what happens is the skills that are represented in those connection strengths are getting overwritten, and that's causing this catastrophic forgetting. While training, each one of these individual tasks that it's trained on, it's doing very well, but unfortunately, it's doing this weird thing where it's forgetting the old things it was trained on. This would be like if you forgot how to drive a car because you learned something from this presentation. So it's not what we do. We want to figure this out. And here's what you get if you combine those three things that I explained to you. Weight sparsity, activation sparsity, and and active dendritic properties, right? That extra bit of mathematical resolution. You can mitigate catastrophic forgetting quite a bit, at least in this rather toy data set. And I wanted to tease this apart a little bit, right? We're changing a lot of things between these two lines. So I decided to lie. Instead of giving task-specific information, right? I always told it, even when it was training on task 2, I told it, hey, I'm training you on task 1. And for all 100 tasks, I did this. So it can't learn any task-specific information, but we still have that extra mathematical resolution going on. And those values, you notice they're learned, they're just constant, right? These green values are different for each neuron. And if we show what that looks like, you actually get the majority of the benefits, and you actually save like a lot of computation, because what I wasn't showing you is behind these producing these green arrows, there's a lot of multiplications. I just didn't have time. I think I'd have time to go into it. But you can reduce your multiplications like 10,000-fold by just lying, right? And just reducing this to a single learnable parameter. Okay, and I got done a couple minutes early. I'll check chat here. I see there's 2 messages. Okay, Austin. Let's see. IMP on Lynette. Plot stopped at 2.2%, but how far can you take it? Where does performance drop off? Yeah, I noted this in the paper. I think there was some rounding error or something, because if we go, let's see if we can go back and look at that. I've only got 60 slides, so there it is. It's supposed to be, if we look at the other ones, notice it goes 100, then 87.5, 76.6. This one, for whatever reason, it instead of removing 12.5, it removed 12.4. So this should have gone to like 1.1. I don't know why not. At some point, the performance has to drop off, but it would be interesting to redo it and see where that point is. And then I'll read your other question here. Active dendrites. Does this have to do with the old adage that you only use 3% of your brain? Yeah, that's very related. If you guys have ever heard that fact, you use 100% of your brain, but never at the same time. And part of the reason is evolution is selected for a lot of just quiet neurons, because when they do produce electrical activity, that's where the majority of their metabolism goes, and their energy is to bring those chemical gradients back to normal. That's where like 60-70% of a neuron's energy is spent, is recovering from sending action potentials.
I have a question.
All right, we got a question from Asim.
Do you know about the lottery ticket hypothesis?
Yeah, that's where this IMP is from, yeah.
Okay, so is that from that paper? Is that IMP from that paper? Okay.
I don't know if he made it, his group made it up, or if it existed before, but yeah, that's the paper that got me interested in it. Yeah.
Okay, so from a biological point of view, it makes sense that like there are certain very specific parts of the brain which do specific things. So you can like remove everything else, and then just even if you use that small part of the network, you can still get the same performance. So that basically it's motivated from biological line of reasoning, right? Like,
yeah, that's a good point. I can add a little more clarity of how this is particularly inspired by the brain. There's a point in development, like Jeff Lichman at Harvard, I think I got this from, and I think he was doing it in like mice, but I'm sure it happens in us too. When you're developing, especially at a young age, you make a lot more connections than you need, and then later on they're like pruned and stuff. And the pruning goes for the weak connections. There's some way the neurons can tell, yeah, this guy isn't contributing much, and I'm connected to this guy, and he's really important, he's really big and strong. I'm going to prune and kill the little dude. And then there's another point where this happens. Let me see here. I've been showing you pyramidal. Where's one? We'll just go all the way back to the beginning. Yeah, so the pyramidal cell, like this one, might have tens of thousands of connections on it. And the connections, even in like our brains, even when we're older, like there's tens of thousands of connections changing, being removed or added every second. And so they do search. It's not just this one-time pruning thing that happens like when you're a kid. Even now, there's some mechanism by which they're testing new sets of connections and they're pruning the weak ones, it seems. You know. Thank you. Trying to get my chat windows back here. They've disappeared. Anybody else from the audience have any questions?
I guess I was also curious. You were talking about sort of the active versus passive dendrites, and you have those green task-specific multipliers. This reminds me of an attention mechanism. So, like, what's the similarity or difference there?
Oh yeah, I hope I'm gonna ask Stefan about this. I don't know. It did really make me think about it, but I do have a tendency to every new thing I'm looking at through grad school, I go, oh, maybe that has something to do with attention. So I'm glad you asked it. That makes me feel validated. Yeah, I mean, even just adding that little, it's essentially, instead of, we talk about like a bias in the weights, it's kind of like a multiplicative bias of the whole thing, of the whole summed input. So the fact that it alone is useful, maybe it has something to do with attention. Tough to say.